All right. Well, good morning, everybody, from wherever you are across the country. This is Craig Davidson with Taurus Ag Marketing here, coming to you with Roddy McNitch, Claude Sonder, and Curtis Russell. This is, I guess, for us, our first kick at the cat to actually have call it a live podcast type setting. You know, we actually, you know, with everybody else in society in the last few weeks, you know, we've been, working to do our part in social distancing, and we've actually been engaging, ourselves actually internally and our customers and across the market, and essentially a new format of or a way of communicating, and we have these internal conversations all the time about agronomy and science and product solutions, and we thought we'd take it, on air in a live format today. And so we welcome you and thank you for joining us, and we appreciate you taking the next 45 minutes, hopefully, or an hour, depending on how the conversation goes. And we're going to talk about nitrogen. Obviously, so here's a very important nutrient in agriculture, and it's been around for 60 or 70 years, and yet you say, how would it make sense for us to still be talking about this nutrient and different ways to utilize it and manage it and maximize it? And that's kind of the basis of our conversation today. If you have any questions, in your go-to webinar icon that'll pop up on your either on your phone or laptop or computer, there is a chat icon. If you click on that, you can actually type in a question. That'll come to us, and we will do our best to answer those questions as we go through this format. I mean, we want to keep it interactive. You cannot actually speak to us on the call here or the webinar. Only the four of us will be able to talk to one another, but we'd be happy to answer your questions if you have them. And yeah, we'll get started. And obviously, again, it's the 16th of April, and we hope that spring is just around the corner. Obviously, some of our markets still got a fair bit of snow on the ground, and as you see on social media, there's a number of growers back out combining here in the last few days in different parts of Western Canada, so that's encouraging. But this begs this question. Obviously, we have had a really tough fall in 2019 with the harvest, and in that essentially caused some issues as far as traditional practices in getting nitrogen applied. And so that's the basis of our conversation today. And I'd like to actually just give everybody a couple minutes to introduce themselves here and where they're from, and some of the market challenges they faced last year and what that could mean for this spring ahead when it comes to nitrogen. So I'll start with Roddy, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, can you hear me, Craig?
You bet.
So yeah, I'm Roddy McNinch. I'm from Panoka, Alberta, and I've been with Taurus for going on 7 years now. I think when I think of nitrogen, some of the challenges we've faced, really Northern Alberta has had some challenges for the last 4 years. And a lot of this is related to logistics. I mean, we've struggled to get the harvest off since 2016, really. And I mean, there's been continual combining every spring. And I think when I look at the question below, what will past wet fall and bad harvest conditions bring us this spring? I see more logistical challenges, and I mean, with that related to nitrogen, I get a lot of questions on how we can speed up seeding in spring, how we can split some of those applications apart. So that's some of the challenge we've faced. Logistics are always a big concern in agriculture, and I think that's one of the things that I'd probably like to address today.
Right on. Okay, thanks, Roddy. Curtis?
Curtis Russell. I joined Taurus last spring, and before that I was with Bayer for 15 years. I think we were pretty fortunate in the vast majority part of the South. Yeah, we had some challenges, and actually right where I live here, there is still a fair amount of crop out, but there is a good chunk of the acres around here did get off. What we have here is probably, it's quite wet, and we're going to be a lot later than normal. So it wouldn't be uncommon for the last week of April to have most drills starting to turn or very ready to go, and we'll be lucky if May 1 we're going. The conversations I've had with growers is more about how do I speed up fill times? What do I, selling phosphate, of course, that comes into the question. So I'm going to probably spend a little more time with growers, understanding they've got 46 sitting on the farm. How do we work with that? Maybe we can figure out a way to work with retail to treat, to spread. UAN is becoming a more common practice here. We don't have a huge fleet of floaters in southern Saskatchewan where I live. So there's a lot of sprayers are doing it. So discussing the value of using top dress UAN and then that increased fertilizer capacity to do maybe back to where I'm a little more comfortable with applying your fungicides at the right time because you have a bigger sprayer or an extra sprayer, or maybe even hitting that Liberty timing right, or being able to do 2-pass Liberty. So those are some of the conversations that I've certainly had, is looking at the whole liquid side, and then of course on farm or working with retail for drive, just get that floater figured out because it's growing. It's not a huge fleet currently. So.
Okay.
Okay, this picture's up there live.
Good thoughts. Right on. Claude?
Yeah, this is Claude Sander out of Saskatoon. Yeah, a bunch of interesting stuff, just like the situation we're in right now. It's crazy having to work out of your house this much and wanting to be on the farm as much as possible. Mike, I think I can hear you talking, Mike, so you might want to mute your phone. But regardless, it's last year was, we didn't get a rain. I'm central Saskatchewan. We didn't get a rain till, oh gosh, I think it was the June 20 something around there, and it was before that it was incredibly dry. And I think one thing it pointed to is the fact that we had not rained at all, and I know there were some parts in far western Saskatchewan that they didn't get that really a rain after that. And you could see the conditions of what happens when you don't get any rain at all. But where we did get the rain, and we didn't get a lot of after that, it's amazing the crops that we got off, and nutrition and nitrogen being one of them, how important that nitrogen or the whole nutrition package is. But I think one of the things that really had me thinking about is, split application, it's another pass, but if you have a year like whether it's really dry or really wet, such a big cost on your farm, what an important tool to have as part of a split app. And with the knowledge that people have spent and the research that people have spent the time on, I think it's, we got a bunch of crops still in the field. We have possibly some really cold conditions. Some places might be too dry. Some places might be too wet. So I think this is a great year to talk about nitrogen, and what it always is, because it's such a big part of your overall expense. So I look forward to this conversation, and I would just throw a bone out there. Any farmer that wants to have a conversation and thinks it's worth the time talking to one of us, we're conversation, because it does get a little quiet around, and trying to phone people whenever we can, and we can't. A lot of people don't want us on their farms, or their retails have certain things set up too where they have to be in. So please reach out to us if you need someone to talk to. That's what we're here for. We'll enjoy it. But thanks, Craig.
You're getting lonely, Claude.
I get lonely. Anytime I get to go to do something outside the house with 5 people in the house here, it can get a little crazy.
Past the point of loving one another. Yep. So I just showed, as we're talking, I'll actually go through some background information and slides as a reference to the conversation here. And, I just showed 3 slides that really reference though we maybe missed our application in the fall, and here we are sitting, we may be combining right now, or we may maybe don't have the space to get it done in time. We want to get the acres in. One positive thing about nitrogen is it's highly mobile. You know, it can move in the soil. 90-some% of all N comes into a plant through mass diffusion. So placement, as we know it, maybe isn't as critical as other nutrients that, you know, are essentially immobile in the soil. And that actually opens up this conversation that if we don't all have it in place or it's not in the ground and we're looking at alternatives, it's a very versatile nutrient. And, you know, it also is required in great amounts, but it's required throughout the whole, you know, growing season of a crop. So that's going to lead to some other questions we have here today around timing and rates and things like that. So what are our options here when we look at if we didn't get it all down in the fall, or if you don't have it on at seeding? I'll just throw it out there, guys. If somebody, you know, what are some of the options you're currently seeing in your marketplace as far as applying nitrogen, aside from, say, fall banding or placing it all at the time of seeding?
I think the majority of the guys in Alberta right now are probably looking at UAN or liquid nitrogen. I mean, as Curtis said, there's not a lot of floaters. There's not a lot of floaters in the marketplace. So if you're looking at a high clearance sprayer, that's a pretty common implement on every farm now. So if as far as buying some, say, 3-prong streamer nozzles, it's a very easy logistical application. And as I said, most sprayers are on farms. So I mean, I think the majority of central northern Alberta, even in the southern Alberta that we see, is a split application of nitrogen. I mean, if you're not getting it all down, if you can't band it in the fall or can't get it down in the spring, I mean, a lot of guys are looking split application, maybe put some down at seeding, and then top dress the rest in a liquid UAN application with the sprayer. And this will probably lead into questions as far as application time and when the nitrogen actually hits the crop. But I mean, we'll get into that as we go.
I think in our world we have you know, there's not everybody has a floater, but there's a lot of floaters around. We do a lot of ammonium sulfate fines floating, and you know, other sulfur products. That seem to be where a lot of it's, you know, kind of started with the floating, but nitrogen's also been a big part of that. So I think for our you know, northern Saskatchewan, there's a lot of opportunity to float urea, and there's, you know, opportunity with the UAN. So you have two really good options, and you know, they're both easy to, most people are both set up easy to, you know, to treat, to handle any volatilization mindsets. But so there's two fairly good options. You know, not everybody has it, but a lot of people can access it or have that option on their farm.
Yeah, and as I showed here, just in a couple slides, I think what probably is the greatest concern is if we take it away from the drill, or if we take it away from fall banding, say, anhydrous, and we don't have that option because we didn't get our anhydrous on, you know, the greatest concern is probably loss. And, you know, as I showed here in these slides, kind of there's three main forms. I guess there's four main forms of loss, but the three that we worry about, obviously, volatilization. So if Roddy's talking about UAN or Claude or Curtis are talking about spreading urea on that surface, obviously this loss of nitrogen to gassing off into the atmosphere is probably our greatest concern of loss in all reality in the application of nitrogen. But there is also, you know, the loss of denitrification due to saturation of soils, and then leaching when it comes to our coarser textured soils. These are some of the things we have to actually take into consideration when we look at maybe a new way of applying nitrogen compared to our traditional practices. The other one actually we don't talk about as much is actually immobilization, and that's that application getting tied up into a thatch or material it's trying to decompose. It has a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, and so in order for that carbon to nitrogen ratio actually come down, it actually takes extra nitrogen to bring that ratio in check. Typically in the soils, the seed-end ratio I think balances out at around 18:1, but something like wheat straw has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of around 50 to 60:1. So next question, if you look at split, if in fact, you didn't get it all down at seeding, I think we'll see some growers this year actually look at maybe applying a portion of their N at seeding if they're going to get pressured or late, maybe putting down a portion of their N, maybe as something like ESN with the seed. And we come in later. Does it work? And what does that timing look like? Or is there more than one application? And so I'll throw that question out. Curtis, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I think for me, the whole split application a lot of times has been driven by growers that want to manage the risk a little bit. Where I am in my little neck of the woods, there's very little anhydrous right in my old Bayer territory, and then as you go north, of course, there's much more. And the whole split N application, what I've seen is if you just plan for it and it becomes part of it, most of those growers have gone to an idea of treating that UAN or treating that urea. And what that's allowed them to do is plan.
Are you still there, Curtis? We maybe lost Curtis for a minute. Anyway, and when we look at this, split up mindset, if it is going to be UAN or urea, I mean, there are some things I think we have to consider here, and that is, what are those potential loss mechanisms and what actually influence some of those losses that could actually take place. And this is a short list of things that we'd actually look to actually give us an indication whether or not those losses actually can happen or be real if we actually take some of that N out of the ground. And we'd even argue today that actually nitrogen in the ground is still potentially at risk depending on the concentration and depending on the depth of placement, that even as we look at, shallow place and high concentration, there is potentially losses that can actually happen. So these are some of the things that we'll actually look at if, in fact, we're going to actually alter our program. Roddy, any thoughts in this regard? I think you're on mute, Roddy.
I think it has to do with the phone.
Okay.
Because I was called in too, and for some reason that got muted. So.
Okay. You can hear me though?
Yeah, I can hear
Can
you.
hear you just fine. Yep.
Okay. Okay.
No, we can't hear you, Roddy.
Can't hear Roddy. You look good, but we cannot hear you.
We have to try rephoning in there, Roddy.
I think what I would really drive home is that if you're going to consider split application, it's really, really important to make a plan to treat it so you're not watching those rain clouds. I think a lot of times when you talk to people, the main hurdle is logistics. I won't have the time to do it. I won't have the sprayer to do it. I don't have a applicator in my community. But what you might find is that if you spend a little time talking about it, there's always a young guy or gal in your community that wouldn't mind doing some custom app, that would be more than willing to blow on some UAN for you. It's not hard to put on. The timing works pretty good. You can do it whenever. There's many retails out there that if you had a conversation with and they could get the acres, would love to run a floater. Most of them have invested in technology to treat urea now with pro coats and other things. So the technology's there, that just needs demand, and that's where growers, retails, and agronomists will create that demand.
Yeah. So a little myth busting, and then I'll reference work that John Hurd did here with Manitoba Agriculture back in 2012. But So if we are looking at split applying it, and even in Manitoba, we do see side dressing actually take place, and that may be a practice that actually would happen on row crops here with corn. But you know, if we go back to some of these indications that actually constitute loss, either volatilization, denitrification, or leaching, placement and concentration, as well as soil pH, can actually have an influence on how stable that N is. And in all reality, when you look at this work that John did, and this would be backed by work that was done by Ag Canada in Quebec years ago, interestingly enough, the greatest losses of that UAN application actually was where they concentrated and applied it into the ground shallow placed. The deep placed, you know, actually was relatively stable. It had more soil on top. Losses were less, and we'll talk about why that is. And actually the surface had losses, but not as much as the concentrated and shallow placed. So these are some of the things that we don't realize. It's almost like we have to unlearn some things about nitrogen to actually relearn when we start looking at new ways of applying this nutrient.
Can you guys hear me now?
Sure can, Roddy.
It would appear I'm back.
Yeah.
I think one of the things we think about split app is, you know, when you're, you know, in a world where you're not guaranteed moisture, and I think, you know, like last year was a great example, is, you know, I was sitting with a grower and he was, you know, planning for obviously the best crop he could grow, and they put everything up front. And so one of the concerns he had was, if I got to put all these nutrients up front, what if I don't get the rain? Then I'm already kind of at you know, my return is a negative. Nitrogen being the major cost of that, you know, the consideration to do a split app of N becomes increasingly important when you're someone who is pushing the envelope, and especially if you're starting off drier in the spring. Yeah, you know, you're not even guaranteed if it's wet in the spring, but you know, it's a good risk application to your farm, is to take a big chunk of that N out and put it later on. Not only does it save you time when you're seeding, a crucial time of seeding, but it's in the stuff you just talked about, that we're not guaranteed to even get all that nitrogen if we're putting it in the ground, and we're putting it in at 2 inches or less. So, you know, you got two different things working against you there. You're putting it all in the ground up front, and if you got soil conditions that are ripe for loss, you may be doing yourself a disfavor by maybe not considering that, you know, the risk mindset of putting it on later when it needs it, and being able to protect yourself of losses that you maybe can't control, or hard to control when you're putting it in the shallow band at high rates.
Yeah. I think one thing we don't.
Pretty big concern that it's like, as far as losses, I talked to guys quite a bit about the concern on losses, and of putting everything up front, and just that divvying up the risk as far as a split application. The one question, I've actually got a couple of questions on the chat room here I want to address, but one of the comments that I get is with a split application or maybe June urea spreading or top dressing, guys are wondering how fast nitrogen gets into the crop. Brent is one of the questions here. He wanted to touch on June urea spreading, and that's probably something farmers talk about most. Well, if I top dress, how soon does it actually get in the crop, and how long does it stay feeding that crop? And I just want to address that. Basically, based on the research that we have out there today, if you are top dressing nitrogen, depending on the amount of moisture you have, that nitrogen can be hitting the root system of your crop anywhere between 10 days and 3 weeks. I know a lot of guys will say as early as a week. I don't know if I see it quite that quick. 2 weeks is a very common. 2 weeks is a very common answer, but I'm going to say between 10 days and 3 weeks, depending on moisture on your farm. Another question we got in the chat room is there a delay in nitrogen availability when treated with RMU or similar denitrification or ammonia volatilization stabilizers? And that's kind of a myth I wanted to debunk right off the get-go as well. I mean, as soon as you're putting nitrogen down, that urease enzyme is attacking that urea prill or your nitrogen in UAN. Under no circumstances do we eliminate eliminate all of the conversion of that nitrogen. It's still going to start converting on day one. What an NBPT or a nitrogen stabilizer can do is just slow down that conversion over a period of as much as 28 days, but common numbers are 3 weeks or 21 days. So just an answer to the questions here. A nitrogen stabilizer does not delay nitrogen availability to the crop. And as far as from top dressing applications, you're generally between 10 days and 3 weeks from when you top dress to when that nitrogen's actually hitting the root system of that crop. So just wanted to cover that off as far as the questions are. Sorry, guys. Carry on.
The amount of moisture in that for that question is a huge part of that equation. Is it real dry when you're applying, or is there moisture to break down that urea right away? If you have no moisture at all and urea just sits there, whether it's treated or not, it'll stay sitting there, and obviously your chance for losses is much greater if it's not treated.
Yeah, and I think if you look at some of this work done by University of Manitoba, when they actually look at what we actually talk about is hydrolysis, and that's the conversion of, say, urea to ammonia and then over to ammonium. Most all the data that we look at typically shows that this hydrolysis starts to happen within 48 hours, and by 3 to 4 days, I mean, you've had essentially that's like lighting it on fire. That urea with that UREASE enzyme is pretty much getting all the way over to ammonia. So within 4 days, and this is kind of goes to what Roddy's saying, you're seeing that conversion happening. And we'll talk a bit about hydrolysis and that enzyme specifically, but pretty much any data, this is University of Manitoba data, you know, it typically shows us that those conversions happen very quickly because of the enzyme, but that means losses can also mount very quickly. And most growers or retailers that have equipment, you know, they'll tell you that everybody's waiting for a rain, so everybody's looking at the forecast. You know, we'll apply it in front of the rain. Well, everybody wants it at the same time, but as you can see, the window is very small. You know, you got 48 hours to do this, and that's not a lot of time. And you know how weather forecasts change. I think last year most people were upset at any weather app that was out there across the marketplace because it changed every 6 hours. They told us it was raining for weeks, and it never did. But so yeah, hydrolysis is real. This enzyme that actually converts it, which is this urease enzyme, it's part of the environment, and it's in all things, and especially it's in higher concentrations where there's thatch. Anything to add to that, Claude?
I think we've lost Claude now.
Sorry, just trying to make sure there wasn't any screaming kids running through the office here. I think the good question that you raised there is there is a lot of research. You can, if you're bored one day and you want to spend some time looking up university research or other research on volatilization or nitrification, denitrification, you could spend a lot of time doing it. And there's a lot of really good research out there, and some of the comments you made are very true when it comes to, you know, the dangers and the opportunity to get your I guess your best ROI. And I think I watched one of our other employees sent out a thing that Ag Canada Research was doing some work on, and he, you know, his comment was too is that in the right conditions these things pay for themselves. And like you said, no one controls the climate, so it changes. You can't tell from one day to the next what's going to happen. So you know, another risk management tool, which I think is extremely important, and a lot of people have got onto that.
Okay.
Hey, Craig, before you move on here, I don't have a question in the chat room, but I got a guy that texted me. He's asking about the information you're showing below as far as some of the nitrogen information in your presentation here. Is asking where he can get that. So I'm just going to say, like, anyone that can see my screen, like if you got one of our product portfolio guides from Taurus, if you are wanting to follow along, just in the agronomy tab, we start talking about nitrogen stabilizers on, I believe it's about page 14. So you get into what, if you are wanting to follow along with any of this information, I mean, that is all in our agronomy section of the product portfolio. Just an answer to that text question. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah. And I will admit we are nitrogen geeks when it actually comes to trying to figure out the whys behind the hows. And so we've put a lot of time and effort into understanding what should be pretty basic information on how, urea converts to ammonia, that converts to ammonium. And yet I think for a lot of us across the marketplace, it's stuff we should know. I mean, it was because when we're applying, even though maybe nitrogen's a little cheaper this year, it's a big cost of our overall program when we look at our cereal acres and our canola acres. And yet anything we can do to manage that better, it all comes back to understanding actually how it works and where our risks are in those applications. So just a quick question. We want to keep this moving along, but why, if we look at hydrolysis and we do the split application, so we're going out there and we actually apply a part of our N in crop, or we do it ahead of the drill or after the drill, and we got a high pH soil. We know hydrolysis is going to happen within 48 hours because of the enzymes there. Why is the pH of the soil important in this equation? Anybody want to take that?
No, I can definitely take that, Greg.
Right.
It's the easy question. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take that. I'm going to jump on the easy questions here. You asked a lot of people, like, what pH actually stands for is potential hydrogen. Some people will say the power of hydrogen, but I commonly say potential hydrogen. So when you look at urea converting from urea to ammonia to ammonium, it needs a hydrogen ion to attach to go from NH3 to NH4. That's what's stabilizing it from a gas to an actual plant available stable molecule. So the amount of hydrogen you have in your soil is a huge indicator as far as how much nitrogen that soil is able to buffer or actually stabilize. In a high pH soil, you don't have a lot of hydrogen available. In a low pH soil, you got very acidic soil, you do have a lot of hydrogen available. So when we look at Western Canada, we look at all those high pH soils, something over 7 or 7.5. Those are soils that are lacking hydrogen, that are extreme risk as far as ammonia volatilization, just because there's not actually enough hydrogen in your soil to stabilize all the nitrogen you're putting down. Someone in a pH of, or someone with a soil with a pH of 6 is going to have a lot more hydrogen to stabilize nitrogen than someone with a pH of 7.5. Does that make sense?
100%. And I show this here. If you see this graphic, look right to the very bottom. It might be small, but this was done by Dr. Overdahl in 1960. So that is, how long ago was that? 60 years ago? 60 years ago.
Has pH changed since then? Has pH changed since then? No,
it's gone higher. It's gotten higher in our soil. Yeah, no. So he was determining in 1960 that pH had a direct influence on volatilization and the stability of nitrogen that we apply. And yet, even in his data, even at a pH of 6 or 6.5, he was still showing losses. It didn't mean like there wasn't losses, but the higher the pH, the more severe, because there's just not enough free hydrogen to stabilize ammonia as ammonium, as Roddy said.
So I think one of the things when you think about, one of the things you think about, I was just saying, one of the things you think about when you put a lot of nitrogen in a tight band. Well, that even if you have a pH of 5, what's going to happen in that band? Once the hydrogen gets taken up, that band naturally, the pH will raise a lot because all that hydrogen is being taken up by the nitrogen. So even in that band, there's some, I don't know if you're showing those or not on here, Craig, but they'll show that what happens to that pH in that band over the 5 days. And it has to balance itself later on, but even in a low pH soil, that band, and that's why you can get those losses on those, even on low pH soils, and it's close to the surface when you're banding a whole bunch of nitrogen at once.
Yeah, as a rule of thumb, just so you know, like as Claude said, in a concentrated band, typically what we see is the pH move of two points. So if you're sitting at 7.5, it could move to 9.5 pH in that band through that process of hydrolysis. So even though you think you're maybe moderate, you're probably looking at a move of 2 points, especially when you concentrate that nitrogen. So you're spiking the pH in that zone for sure.
I think if you go back to that research from the 60s, Craig, I mean, it's I'm just curious to know. I don't think it said on there, but application rates of nitrogen in the 60s were probably what?
50 pounds actual, maybe, yeah.
20, 30, 40 pounds. I mean, I've got guys putting 150 pounds actual. I think it's, and this kind of goes back to some of the conversations we get with nitrogen losses, but I mean, I hear a lot of guys will say, okay, it's going to cost me an extra 7 or 8% to put a nitrogen stabilizer on my urea. I'm not going to spend that extra 7 or 8%. Instead, I'm just going to spend that much money on more urea. And I mean, when you look at this research, I mean, that back in the 60s, they were probably putting 20, 30, 40 pounds of nitrogen down at most. But I mean, just to address that, I think it's important to know that regardless of how much nitrogen you put down, your soil only has so much hydrogen. I mean, if your soil has enough hydrogen to stabilize 60 pounds of nitrogen, it's going to stabilize 60 pounds of nitrogen. If it has enough hydrogen to stabilize 80 pounds of nitrogen, it's going to stabilize 80 pounds of nitrogen. I mean, anything over and above that, you're going to see losses. So those guys out there that are saying, well, rather than apply nitrogen stabilizer, I'm just going to add more urea. Well, you're just contributing to more losses. And I think that's the difference. Like when you look at a 1-inch band compared to a 2, 3, or a 4-inch band, we don't see a lot of losses in a 4-inch band, for the simple fact that there's that much more hydrogen above that nitrogen to stabilize that process. So just something to
interesting question that came up, regarding, sampling is the way you get your pH. You have to go out there and do some sampling. But the question that came up was, what if you just did the top 2 inches separately in a sample? What would you see? What would you see for a pH difference? And, how does that affect the nitrogen that you're applying? Any comments there?
Yeah, I would say typically it's actually probably a little bit lower on the surface, and it gets higher depending on your subsoil. What is your subsoil made of? If you're a calcareous base, your pH tends to actually increase as you go deeper, and we tend to see pH, especially if we've done a lot of acidity or acid fertilizers over the years. Usually it is a little bit more acidic closer to the surface. Yeah.
Until you get to hydrolysis and you get that pH spike of nitrogen eating up all your hydrogen. And this is a great question.
And
suggesting sampling the top 2 inches separately. I mean, that's a great question. That kind of leads down a whole different layer of agronomy. But I do like that question from Scott.
And that's where I say, so if you do that 2 inches and it comes back at say 6.5, which could be the case even though your 6-inch sample is sitting at 7.7, keep in mind if you put a shallow band of nitrogen there, urea, you probably are still going to move that 2 points in that band. So you'll go from 6.5 and all of a sudden in 4 days it's got a pH of 8.5. So the stability is still very much at risk because of that.
Yeah, we got a real interesting comment or question regarding putting sulfur with your N and the idea of, I guess, sulfur producing more hydrogen. What's you guys' thoughts on the effect of, putting sulfur with your, whether it's your UAN or your or near your urea? Urea is a little tougher unless it's all in one, but what's your thoughts on that?
I don't mind answering that one. I think there's been a lot of talk about adding sulfur with nitrogen for the simple fact that whether you're dealing with elemental sulfur or ammonium sulfate, you're going to acidify your soil. So if you acidify your soil in theory, you're adding more hydrogen or freeing up more hydrogen. By freeing up that hydrogen, you're providing hydrogen to stabilize your NH3 to NH4 in a plant available nitrogen form. So it's a great question from Brett, and it does apply. I guess the one question that I would throw back to some of this line of thinking is the time frame in which that happens. I mean, we know that nitrogen is going to convert in 24 to 48 hours. I know Taurus has sold an awful lot of elemental sulfur over the years, and I mean, we know that conversion process takes quite a bit longer than that as far as freeing up hydrogen. Ammonium sulfate's definitely a little quicker, but I know even on some of the research in regards to ammonium sulfate, we see an acidification, we see hydrogen becoming available, but it's not necessarily at the speed that nitrogen converts. And Craig, maybe you can touch on that, because I think you've seen some research on the ammonium sulfate and the acidification effect of ammonium sulfate.
Yeah. So I think if we're actually talking sulfuric acid as a molecule is actually H2SO4. So in order to actually create sulfate, it releases those hydrogen molecules. Now you got free hydrogen to stabilize ammonia, and you're left with SO4. But if you're just applying sulfate, there's no H2 on that. But keep in mind, this is where it gets interesting. Inside of ammonium thiosulfate, there is actually a percentage of that liquid that's actually elemental sulfur. And that elemental sulfur in its fine particulate will actually, it'll go through this process of converting to sulfuric acid and then sulfate. So it will produce some hydrogen. But it's, again, it's that timeline, as mentioned. How long does it take for that elemental to convert? Is it going to happen inside of 48 hours? If it does, it's going to offer some hydrogen to stabilize that urea portion of the UAN. If it doesn't, if it's cold when you're applying this, then chances are it won't happen quick enough. So I think the science is the science is real. The science is there, and it makes sense because of the hydrogen aspect of it. But it comes down to the agronomy, and that's usually when you apply it, how quick that converts to produce hydrogen. And I just think that's variable, and it may not be quick enough at times, meaning that you're probably better to have an actual stabilizer that actually blocks the actual enzyme, the urease enzyme that converts urea to ammonia, which happens inside of 48 hours. So does that kind of answer it, Roddy? Is that what you were looking for?
I think, yeah, that's what I was going after. Is I just the time difference between the acidification of ammonia versus the time frame of urea converting to ammonia. And I think any of the research we've seen on that is that research is going to be 24 to 48 hours urea or nitrogen, and a lot of your sulfate sources, like you said, the science is sound. It's just the timing is variable.
Right. Yeah, I think it's the amount of one versus the other as well. Do you have enough sulfur? I know the NDS ratio is a whole different conversation, and how important that is, which is a totally different agronomy talk. But yeah, you guys are both right on that. Is there enough, and does it happen at the right time?
Yep. And I don't have it in here, but this is kind of the next question, but we could actually throw amidas into this conversation too, obviously, which is a combination of sulfate and urea that could speak to both of those conversations we just had. The NDS ratio is great. It's important, but is it providing hydrogen to stabilize the urea as it converts? And I'd say that's kind of the unknown. And we see people putting inhibitors on even things like amidas to reduce that conversion of urea to ammonia. So if we look at products like ESN or Super U that have been around for a long period of time, I mean, we actually spent 5 years ourselves actually developing ESN in Western Canada, so we know it quite well as Taurus. But how well would they work in a split application mindset and call it our 100-day window for growing a crop in this marketplace? What are your thoughts? And this is questions we do get, because they are actually very good products. They work very well. But again, it's not about science here. It's actually probably more about logistics and agronomy when we answer this question. I'm not going to answer it, so who wants to talk to it?
I'm letting you go, but we can't hear you. I'll take it. Yeah. ESN's another layup. I mean, I'm a pretty big fan of ESN. Are you back, Curtis? Do you want to take it? No, we don't got them. So it's so I mean, ESN's a layup. It's ESN is a great product, polymer coated prill. It's been around a long time. Well, when I'm talking ESN, I'm saying logistics. It's probably the most seed safe product you can put down in the seed row or through the drill. When you're talking about split applications or floating nitrogen or mid-row banding nitrogen, where seed safety isn't as much of a concern, there are probably other options as far as nitrogen stabilizers, different products out there that are maybe a more cost-effective or higher return ROI products out there. But when it comes to putting nitrogen in or close to the seed row, ESN is kind of your go-to. That polymer coating is going to be the most seed-safe product out there. So,
yeah, I think what. Go ahead, Claude.
I'm just going to talk to the Super U. I guess, I'm just giving my opinion from some of the stuff that I've looked at, but Super U is also a great product and in the right situation. But one of the mindsets behind Super U is that you're trying to keep it in the ammonium form so it doesn't move in the soil. So if you're floating something like a Super U and you're not getting a lot of, just enough moisture, not a lot, but you have the other side of it that's keeping it in the ammonium form, then you don't get that movement in the soil. And if you're applying the Super U on the top, or nitrogen on the top, what do you want it to do? You want it to get to where, you want it to get to the roots. So, if you have conditions, say sandy, this is totally down an agronomic path, so it's a great conversation. So if you have super sandy soil, you have the moisture, it might make real good sense to put it down in that. But if you have heavy clay soil and maybe don't have as much moisture, just a little bit of moisture, are you better off just going with a straight NDP, something that controls the UREASE enzyme? That would be where my head would go. So it's,
and I would say, just to finish this up, is it also is a timing thing, right? If we're talking cereals or canola on a split app, and I'll go back to Scott Park's question here, is that what's our days to actually utilization of that nitrogen? And if we want to get it into the plant inside of 10 days to 20 days, like Roddy said, these technologies probably are going to prolong that a little further out as far as its availability to the crop. Things like corn, a longer season crop like corn, where we maybe don't need that nitrogen till the second week in July through that rapid elongation phase. And, I'd say, if we're going to go out and put on like a dual inhibitor, like a Super U mindset or ESN, a polymer coat, then that could make sense. The challenge with polymer coat is it stays on the surface. It doesn't actually mitigate into the soil. So we may not, if it dries out, it may dry out on the surface, and then we're not losing the end, but we're not actually getting it into the rooting zone.
Did you get a chance to sell ESN, Craig? Back in your day?
I had 5 years chance to sell it. Yeah,
So
it was a lot of fun. I mean, we love the product, and it's great technology, and it's actually changed the way we think. It was kind of the leader when we started talking about managing nitrogen, and today it's still a great fit. Now, for us, we'd actually say if you're going to look at split application, it could be a great piece of your upfront in the drill because you can put it with the seed, and it's going to give you some stability as well. So, yeah.
So just clarification, you were more concerned about the dual as far as the Super U versus just a single, UREASE inhibitor, right?
It's if you're going to go, say, June 15th, you're doing your split app, and you decide maybe we just, instead of urea and treating it, and we got some Super U, or the retail has some Super U left over, will that work as a good option? And I guess the question comes down to the timing. What crop are we growing is probably the next series of questions that need to be asked, because if it is wheat, and that wheat is basically going to take all of its N in by the 10th of July, and this isn't really releasing until the middle of July, then you say, well, maybe we're going to miss that window of peak demand.
I think I'm back.
Okay.
We got a lot of other questions. I don't know if you guys want to cover those off, or if you want to keep going, Craig.
We'll just keep going here, and then we'll try to answer some here at the end. I mean, obviously this is great and good conversation, but we want to respect everybody's time too, and on a Thursday morning. So do I need to worry about losses from UAN? This is a question we get a lot, because you say, well, it's not all urea. Is it as prone to loss? It's actually in liquid. Is it more stable? And I'd say this is something we want to address here, and I'll show a couple reference slides that I have. This is from University of Manitoba in Greenhouse, and it shows cumulative loss of nitrogen as urea And then I show the same work done as UAN. And basically what you see, this goes back to the same data from day 2 to day 4, losses mount. Maybe a little bit of a delay with UAN, but in all reality, we still see losses here happen, even though it's not all urea. It's 50% urea, 25% ammonium, 25% nitrate. So 50% of all your nitrogen is already converted over. So what happens here, part of the science here, is that when that urea converts, it'll spike the pH like we talked about. And if that pH spikes in that dribble band or whatever, however you're applying it, stream jet, you can actually, once your pH goes over a pH of 9, you'll actually pull some of that ammonium back to ammonia. So your losses can actually be losing some of what you thought was already stable because of that change and spike in pH. Any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's also the easiest one to stabilize. Logistically, it's so simple. Many growers, it's less than a jug in a tank. So I think for me, in my neck of the woods, if you're trimming back a little bit because of commodity prices and you're unsure whether or not you want to swing for the fence on, a late start in seeding on May 1st, UAN is by far the easiest for everybody involved, the retail and the grower. When it does start to rain and you do have a nice crop that is into moisture in many parts of Western Canada, is established, looks good, no frost, those are some of the nice things. You can look at a 14-day forecast. UAN is, in my opinion, one of the easy buttons for if you've never done a split application, and the easiest to treat to make sure that you're comfortable, you're not seeing those high losses that we saw in the studies in the 60s that still resonates with everybody's brain, that I'm going to lose what I put on the ground, because we've taught everybody that. So.
Yeah, like one of the things I talked about looking up research, it is actually quite easy to find urease inhibitor effect on UAN. And I guess think of the mindset of urea, that it has to melt down with moisture. Well, liquid urea, how long does it take to melt down a liquid? Well, that kind of answers itself right there. But so it's easy to find. It's actually quite easy to find research on UAN and the importance of an inhibitor, especially if a lot of times we're putting these products down, and if we're June, usually we're warmer. I know we can have some cold days, but we're warmer. And what happens, in warmth? That's usually your worst time frame. So that's where my head would go with UAN. But encourage you. Look up.
Yep. So yes, we agree that even UAN, it makes sense to protect and manage that. I'll go back to the parameters of what are you putting it into? What is the timing? What is the soil environment with the soil pH? How much free hydrogen is there? Right? Those are things that we still need to take into consideration. I think we've answered this question around AMS as far as helping stabilize. I think the basis of agronomy here, above all else, whether it stabilizes or not, is still the importance of an N-to-S ratio. And I think there's definitely merit and value there. I mean, we talk about MEDIS as a great product with that combination of sulfur and urea, but even adding some AMS to your UAN isn't. I mean, that's agronomically. I think we could all agree that would make sense to make sure that ratio stays in balance.
ATS.
ATS, sorry. Claude corrected me, but yeah, it's ATS, not AMS. Yep.
I was going to say that's a pretty good lead into the protein conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So, good question. And there's been a fair bit of focus on this in recent years. I mean, obviously protein swings, premium swings change from year to year, but I think ideally if we could maximize yield and maximize protein on an annual basis, I think that would make the most sense for any grower. But the question we get is, what is the timing and rate for enhancing protein in, say, something like hard red spring wheat? Who wants to take this one?
I'd be happy to.
Yep.
I mean, I talk to a lot of consultants variance as far as when the timing for application for top dressing. I mean, you get a lot of people that are going to say that milky dough stage, a week or two after fungicide timing, just a grain fill is when you want to increase nitrogen application. I guess my opinion, and this is strictly my opinion, but that's the point of today's webinar, or my opinion is that if we're feeding the correct amount of nitrogen and sulfate throughout the entire growing season, that protein isn't going to be an issue at the end of the year. So I'm a big fan of top dressing, but I also want to balance that sulfur to nitrogen ratio all the way out through that fungicide timing and beyond. So as far as my nitrogen application time frame, if I'm top dressing, I still want to hit it in that early June time frame in Alberta, because I want that. Of course, I stabilize my nitrogen, but if I hit it in early June, I'm providing nitrogen to that crop about mid to the third week in June. But if I'm stabilizing that nitrogen, it's going to continue to provide or continue to feed that crop all the way out through July, mid-July, even up to the start of August. So if I'm feeding that crop all the way out to there, I'm getting very close to, or maybe even through that milky dough stage where that seed is filling. Now, that's my opinion on the nitrogen top dress. As far as the sulfur application to create that protein, I mean, I'm strictly going with ratios. I have some pretty aggressive sulfur to nitrogen ratios. On canola, I'm going as aggressive as 3-to-1 nitrogen to sulfur. On cereals, I'll go 5-to-1. Pulses maybe 6-to-1. I mean, or sorry, I've swapped those. On pulses 5-to-1 and cereals 6-to-1. I know some people will disagree with that, but I also know any of the cereal, any of the wheat we're growing, we're not really having protein issues either. So it's so that's strictly my opinion on nitrogen application timing and N-to-S ratios when it comes to protein.
I think where I am, one of the more, just something we all need to get used to is we're not planning to grow 85, 90 bushel wheat sometimes. Some areas around here have even broke 100. And when you look at the uptake charts of the nitrogen that's needed, I think we need to readjust some of our goals. And one thing I've learned working with crop intelligence is that one of the greatest predictors of yield when they've looked at thousands of probes is, I should say hundreds, is that what the grower picks as a yield in a lot of cases is what ends up being that target, that yield. And it's because every decision that we make is based off of yield. So when that, if you have somebody with a protein issue, they might be really happy with their yields. And a lot of times just going through those uptake charts and having a conversation, you might just find that the ratios are out. They're not applying enough of a certain nutrient, or maybe they're really behind on something as simple as nitrogen, and the plan needs to be, even if they're putting it all up front, making a better plan so they have a chance to get high protein. It's really hard to grow high protein and high yields if you're putting on the same fertility program you've been doing for the last 5 years.
I think that's a great point, Curtis. I mean, I'm giving you my opinion based on what we've seen, and I mean, it's kind of pointless now because we have the technology out there. We don't need that experience anymore. I mean, we have the technology out there today that I mean, you can pinpoint that time frame and that nitrogen availability and that sulfur availability and those N-to-S ratios at any time throughout the growing season. So I mean, that's a great point.
The bar is higher, and we need to. Farmers have a tendency to be a little bit negative. I've had that conversation with a grower who was complaining to me about protein, and I said, you know, you told your agronomist you wanted to grow 60 bushel wheat. You grew 74. That's why you didn't get protein. So your plan was to grow 60. It's unfortunate, but that's why.
Well, I think we've lost Greg now. We seem to be having some technical difficulties as far as the.
Oh, there he is. You're back.
Yeah,
Greg.
I think Krista mutes me when she's sick of hearing me, so that's what's going on. Yeah. I would just finish this up, and as far as this question, because it's a common question across the market, but there is good research. There's recent research here out of Manitoba. Amy Mandan with the University of Manitoba has actually done a very extensive research trial. John Hurd maybe been involved, or Don Flayton in that too, but they're learning again. He said, geez, it's late applications, 30 pounds of UAN or 30 pounds of urea broadcast. They're seeing not just protein, as all the way out to heading, but they're actually also seeing an increase in yield with those applications, which is interesting on wheat. So provided that the balance is still there, I mean, as the conversation's gone here, don't be scared to actually throw a tissue test into this mindset too, because if your tissue test at that time of heading is telling you that your N-S ratio or your N to K ratio isn't where it needs to be, then putting on more N probably isn't going to help drive more protein if you're really deficient in sulfur, or if potassium is actually very low at that stage of the crop's life. It's hard to transfer all that energy to the grain heads. Yeah. All right, we're getting towards the end here, but can we use water management and identification as a tool to best manage nitrogen applications? I mean, we are entering this era where we have a whole new set of data coming our way with moisture probes, and we're seeing more and more of them being utilized across the marketplace. I'll maybe throw this to Curtis, because he's worked fairly closely in this regard with some growers, and what are your thoughts as far as using it? Water management, like a soil moisture probe, to actually help us determine nitrogen application.
Yeah, I think any tool that you use, what I really like about the moisture probe is you're not predicting what's in the soil. You're not just looking at rainfall. Last year was a great example of, we didn't get a lot of rain, but the soil moisture profile was quite full. The other nice thing about them is they show us that going into seeding, we have and showed us this last fall that we have a significant full water profile. Now, obviously, some people knew that. We don't need a moisture probe to tell us when our combines are getting stuck. But what it tells us in areas where it's marginal, that we do have yield potential, and it allows us to make plans. I think it's hard to look at an app on our phone and say we can grow 100 bushel wheat or 90 bushel wheat. But when we see it, it makes us think differently, and do we want to chase it? Just because water potential is there, you may not be able to. You may not be able to do it financially. You may not be able to do it because you don't have enough phosphate in the ground to get going. You don't have enough phosphate to get to 110 bushel wheat. But I think the best part about it is it takes the highs and lows out of farming. When you're using a moisture probe, when it doesn't rain for 2 weeks, it'll tell you you're still okay. I watch that app every day. I check it probably more than once, even though I know it only updates daily. I just can't help myself. So if you've never used one, or you don't know anybody that's used one, I'd really stress that it does help you understand not only what's happening in your soil from a moisture standpoint, but also from how to manage that opportunity. And in some cases, growers that have these moisture probes generally like to swing for the fence. In some cases, it woes the horses a little bit when you get that 2-inch rain and you think, oh, well, now it's go time, when really that 2-inch rain didn't really move your yield potential that much. So I think these tools, if you're struggling whether you should be top dressing or not, a lot of times it's from lack of information and the confidence to know that potential's there. So they're not yield predictors. There's so many other things I mentioned that could cause you to not reach what that number is. But it tells you where that oak slat is on the barrel, and it tells you that nitrogen now has become limiting for some growers. And I think if you're not using it, I would reach out to somebody in your area. There probably is one, and try to learn. You're more than welcome to reach out to me or to anybody else. South Country's team is great. I found that the growers that have it and use the tool make good decisions. And top dressing nitrogen is if you use that tool with top dressing, that's generally where you see the greatest value. You know, in farming today, it's pretty hard to find a tool that'll give you another 5, 10, 15 bushel yield bump. This tool in combination with liquid nitrogen or dry with urea can do that. There's not a lot of those left.
Yeah. One of the comments, I have a few grower friends who do use these, and you know, the one thing for sure, it is addictive. They do enjoy looking at it. But the other thing is the comment that they made, which I probably thought was kind of the best information again, is consistency. Is how consistent the information they were getting to what they did worked in hand. You know, was it absolutely perfect? Well, no, but it was very consistent. So they were getting really good. If it was telling them to do something, if they did it, they got that result. Which is, you know, if you can get a tool, moisture is such a huge part of what we do, and it's the one thing that, unfortunately, we can't control what we get unless we're on irrigation. So if we have a tool that actually helps us manage what we can't control a bit, how handy is that? That blows my mind that we haven't had. There's not more options like this. It's such a good option.
Well, and it's not meant to be a joke, but from a mental health standpoint, to look at an app when it hasn't rained for 3 weeks and it tell you that you know your wheat can still run 65, it really does help. It sure helped me get through last year, and you can just see that when you're talking with growers that have this tool and don't. It really does take some of the highs and lows out. I did tell you it does take out the highs. You know, that 2-inch rain you're going to see does not matter like you thought it did in the past, especially in our really heavy clay soils where I live. So,
yeah, great conversation, and this could be a whole other podcast in this regard. Just to wrap that up, I'll make 2 points. Is one, you know, going into 2020, I think it's safe to say across our marketplace, you know, and some of these probes are in the ground now or through the winter, you know, we are sitting on a world of crop potential right now. You know, most profiles in all markets are full or probably over full, meaning that water right now isn't a limitation. I mean, this is going to help us determine historical rainfalls moving forward, but we are sitting on a really big potential crop year with available water in the soil. Currently, our profile is full in most all growing regions in the market. The last thing I'll say, just to speed this up, but it's at the Crop Intelligence Summit last November, one thing that I took home out of it, and they had, call it 800 plus probes across Western Canada last year. They said on average, when they looked at the programs, grower programs, and available water, on average across those probes, there was 17 bushel an acre left on the table. So the available water to actually grow a crop and how much crop actually came off the field, on average, there was 17 bushel an acre left on the table. And to me, that speaks specifically to us trying to achieve protein in wheat. If we're leaving that much yield on the table, then it's hard to actually get the protein to come along with it, because you usually got to maximize yield and then you maximize protein. So if you're leaving that much yield, then it's going to be harder to get the protein to come along until you fulfill that yield.
I would add to that, if it was 17 last year, imagine what it is going to be this year with a full profile.
Yeah, we started most of those profiles last year. Curtis, you're right. We're not full at all. No.
Yeah. If you have a customer, if you're a farmer on here, or you're a retailer and agronomist, and the plan for fertility is exactly what it was going into last year, you may, you know, nitrogen's the obvious one, but it certainly is worth revisiting to make sure that you certainly have more water potential. There's always factors, but it's something to consider, to revisit, talk about top dressing, or talk about maybe turning some other nutrients up if you have more water than you did last seeding and your plan is exactly the same.
Yep. Good. Well, I'll just finish up here. Obviously, you know, we're over an hour into this, and we appreciate everybody that stayed on for as long as you have, and if you have had to drop off with other things going on. But, you know, these are the types of conversations we have all the time internally, and we have a passion for everything agriculture when it comes to Taurus. And then if we can take that passion, figure out the science and the agronomy, and then help deliver a solution, really that's the core of our business. And so when it comes to nitrogen and nitrogen management, I mean, we think there's a whole marketplace full of great products out there today, but it comes down to applying the right agronomy and putting them in the right spot to get the best result. And for us, obviously, I mean, having 2 nitrogen management products in our portfolio from Active Agri-Science based in Saskatoon now with production there. You know, we feel our products that have been researched here in Western Canada as well are showing the type of information that we're looking for, provided we put them in the right situation. So if you need more information or if you want to reference some of this data, I would tell you on our website, taurus.ag, we'll have this information available. We have, you know, our Taurus portfolio. If you don't have one of those copies, this type of information is also in those booklets. But it basically speaks to everything that we're talking about here today, and it's backed up by science. You know, we have the research. This is obviously, again, we thank University of Manitoba for doing this work for us here 2 or 3 years ago. But it actually gives us an option to back up what we talk about here on a daily basis. Today, we're bringing it to you live, and how we talk about things internally or with our customers. And if you got any more questions, by all means, you know, reach out to one of our folks here across Western Canada, and we'd be happy to have the same type of conversations we've had here today. Or if you got any more questions here at the end of our podcast, or if we missed any questions, guys.
I don't know if Rob is still on, but if he is, I'd answer his question about herbicides.
Okay. Go ahead.
I guess I could just answer it. So the thing about adding UAN with herbicides, it does, you know, it is a practice. It does happen with certain herbicides. They'll use UAN. Others, they're going to use AMS. The risk is crop phyto. Generally, why they're added is to improve efficacy. That's the whole point of them. And if you add too much, you can hurt the crop. What happens is that fertilizer is used to take the product into the weed to increase efficacy, while it is also taking more of the herbicide into the crop as well. So what I found over the years was when someone was trying to figure out a way to get more nitrogen on with the herbicide with a flat fan nozzle, what we ended up finding was that the amount that you would actually achieve isn't really enough to make a difference. From a nitrogen macro standpoint. So if you're thinking of using it as a way to get another 10 or 15 pounds of nitrogen out, that's probably not the best way to do it. It can be a little hot on the crop. Well, not can be, it likely will be. So, and if you're ever adding anything to the tank with a herbicide, always reach out to the company you're using it with, just to learn if it's even compatible. You don't want to have a mess in the tank, but also just how bad is it going to be? And there's very few out there that you can add a significant amount of UAN to consider not having to go back and do a top dress later. So especially with UAN.
Hey, Curtis, Craig, I had a question about what app was that you guys were referring to with the crop moisture?
So South Country, when you buy and subscribe to Crop Intelligence, so you have to have a probe to do it, or if you're an agrologist and you have a customer that you work very close with, they can give you access. So that I don't have a probe, I have a customer that we've been friends a long time, and I get access to their data. So the Crop Intelligence app from South Country is the app that I'm addicted to. So.
Okay. Couple more questions. It's funny, we got a lot of great questions here, which is fantastic. That means you know, our audience is engaged, and you know, there's some talk about melting urea solutions, putting that on, which has actually become more of a common practice here in Western Canada. Challenges, you know, are you set up, you know, growers set up to do that properly. It is a little bit of once you figure it out, it's not too bad, but you become a bit of a chemist in your yard to get that figured out. And then how much can a plant actually handle? You know, can it take 7 to 10 pounds? Maybe it can. But that urea still has to go through a process of hydrolysis on the leaf. And that itself, you know, could be an issue over time. So things you have to consider. If in fact you need 30 pounds to move the bar, both in yield and protein, doing a foliar melt of urea, in 7 to 10 pounds maybe won't get you there. If everything else is in place in the soil and you just are going after some extra protein, then I'd say, yeah, we've seen that work very effectively. We have a couple foliar products ourselves that we have Pro4Man for the market, which is a foliar slow feeding nitrogen, and now a product called Grain Fill, which is a combination of Pro4Man and a product called Connect, which is potassium and sulfur. So a combination that's more designed to actually enhance the overall quality of the grain. If you're trying to deliver or move the bar a long ways, then I say you still got to go back to putting on 20 or 30 pounds of UAN dribbled or stream jetted to the soil or broadcasting that as urea. But
you're talking
keep in mind, actual pounds, actual N. But you still would want to treat or protect that. Yeah.
I think the good rule of thumb is the max you can usually melt is 1 pound actual per gallon. So if you're applying Liberty, for example, the most you could get on is 10 pounds actual. So it's not, again, growers that have a aggressive fertility program and are split app, generally what you'll find is they're using it with some of their crops, but actually the one I just used, the Liberty, the customer I know that does it does not do it with their Liberty because it makes it very hot, makes for more bronzing, and they're dop dressing 30 pounds, not 10. So they're going
I think you're getting pretty aggressive, even getting 10 pounds, whether you're going 10 pounds of nitrogen with 10 gallons, that's pretty aggressive already. I would expect to see some damage at that point. I mean, I've quite often, I know a lot of guys melt in urea, and I mean, I'm not opposed to it. I think it's, I just think expectations need to be set, and I'm in that 3 to 5 pounds of actual N is what we're calculating in per application, and even that's with 10 gallons of water.
What's an interesting thing about urea is the Synergy folks talk about, Synergy Ag guys talk about the type of urea, like the quality of the urea and the components within that urea that can, so if you could have a poor grade urea that can cause a lot more damage than, a high grade, say a food grade urea, something like that, can be quite a bit different. So it's interesting, there's components within how they make it is important too.
And make sure you're filtering it. There's bolts and all kinds of interesting stuff in urea because it was never meant to go in a sprayer when the people are dealing with it. So it's just real. It just is. So
yeah, and there is a difference between melting urea and foliar applying UAN too. Foliar applying UAN can be hotter for sure, right? And there is some thought, especially in the U.S., we see that happening, and they're putting a stabilizer in there that will offer some safety, but not maybe the true safety we need if we're trying to go a little more aggressively with UAN as a foliar. Just probably not a great fit. Yep. Last question I'll take here is, RMU, how much money are growers spending to apply this? And typically you're looking at around 6 cents per pound of actual treated, whether it's UAN or urea. And the question is the value there? And I say, well, sometimes not about what you're spending to protect the overall application. It's actually what you're saving from loss. And as simple as if you actually saved yourself 8 to 10 pounds N that might have gassed off or volatilized, and it cost you, $5 to do that or $6 to do that, that 10 pounds could equate to 3 bushels of canola. So it's the actual savings of, managing that nitrogen to turn into yield is where the true benefit comes from. So investing and protecting actually, to me, comes down to hopefully turning that into more bushels, and that's how we look at it. Yeah. So with that, unless you guys got anything else you want to cover off? We're definitely over time, as we always do. We get excited about talking about stuff, and next thing we're like, oh, geez, we've gone too long, and we, people have stayed on. We do appreciate it, and hopefully this is, value. We plan to do more of these in the future on different topics around agronomy and fertility. So Thanks again for joining. Anything else, guys, before I sign off?
I just say if you are interested, send in your agronomy, what type of topics you'd like to hear us talk about. If you're interested, I think that'd be interested. See that as well.
Okay. Roddy?
I would add make a plan.
No, I was saying the same thing. It's we like talking agronomy. So if you enjoyed this with the four guys, if there's a specific topic you would like to address, fire one of us an email, and we can definitely look at having another session.
Or if you really want to see Adam Smith on here really bad, make sure you throw that out there too.
Curtis?
Well, I was just gonna. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, if you're gonna do something, make sure you make a plan, and make sure you tell somebody else that plan. A lot of times, we will hear from retails that this grower had intentions of doing it, but we just didn't get it figured out in time. And something as simple as having RMU in place to treat. It sounds silly that, well, why wouldn't they? Well, if you've never done it before and no one else in your area has done it before, so just have that conversation with your retail. You don't have to commit to it. Just let them know that you're thinking about it. And something as simple as your agronomist, giving them a heads up. And if you're an agronomist, have that conversation with the grower that if you're going to think about this, we should probably tell somebody other than the two of us. So,
yeah. And that's why we're having this conversation now. Don't be scared if you're going to be challenged getting your nitrogen on this spring at the time of seeding. Don't fret about it. There is lots of options. The split app, the top dress, that whole mindset is absolutely fantastic. It's working very well. Just make sure you understand the agronomy and make sure you're protecting that investment. So with that, thanks very much for joining, and thanks guys for coming on and sharing your thoughts and opinions. And hopefully this weather smartens up here toot sweet and we see some equipment rolling in the fields right away. So take care and stay safe. Thanks everybody.
Later. Bye-bye.
See you guys.